Greetings, everyone. It is Tim with Tabletop Terrors here, and we're also joined by Barker with Absolute Tabletop and Wizards of the Coast alumni Rodney Thompson here for our panel in Brigade Con. So we're going to talk about publishing tabletop RPGs in 2015. It's going to be a real loose, conversational sort of panel, and Barker and I from Absolute Tabletop are going to cover a lot more of the indie stuff, probably more with questions than answers. And we're going to just pick Rodney's brain. And so I guess we'll go ahead and throw it to Barker first. No, I'm just kidding. Because I was specifically supposed to ask the first question. Yeah. So first, Rodney, what, as far as your role in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the first thing I kind of wanted to ask you was, what's the thing that you would say you had the heaviest hand in this new game?
So if you look at a lot of the actual game mechanics, especially in the player's handbook, but also some of the stuff in the monster manual, I had a lot to do with actually creating the game mechanics. So I was one of the principal game designers behind the core system. I also designed a lot of the classes, feats, basically anything sort of crunchy and mechanical in the player's handbook. There's a good chance that I had my hands on it in some way. And then for the monster manual, I did a lot of the sort of behind-the-scenes math work. And then for the Dungeon Master's Guide, I actually wrote a lot of the alternate rules. So my role was primarily on the pure game design side of things.
Excellent. So of that, it sounds like you did quite a bit. What's the thing that you're most proud of coming out of 5th? If you had to pick one thing that you just feel like you nailed.
I'm actually really proud of the core system, of the basic resolution mechanics, and the fact that we were able to stick to our guns and keep a pretty simple system, sort of at the base of the game, that encourages dungeon masters to make all the sort of calls on the fly about, like, oh, what kind of roll are you going to make? Do you even need to make a roll, etc. As opposed to asking the dungeon master to go to the book, look up this rule, find this reference, etc. It was one of our really early goals in the game that we wanted it to be something that was quick to run, but also was something that the dungeon master felt like they had a lot of ability to improvise with, and a lot of ability to sort of run with whatever crazy ideas the players had. Because our thinking was that if the DM can handle any situation the players throw at him or her, then those players might be encouraged to think more creatively and to do more creative things, because it's not like one of those deals where it's like, oh, okay, I want to do this thing, and the DM's like, hang on, let me go get my DMG and look up the rules for this, right? So I'm really proud of the sort of lean, streamlined, quick core system we have. Just that sort of, there's 3 different types of rolls. You pick a roll, you pick an ability score, and then maybe you give advantage or disadvantage based on the situation. Like that sort of base resolution system, and the fact that we were able to, through the whole playtest process, kind of cling to that and make that an essential part of the game. I'm really, really happy that it ended up that way, because now when I run the game, that means I rarely even crack a book, right? I've got my monster stats in front of me, and I'm just improvising based on what the players say they want to do.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's fantastic. So with that said, you also did a huge beta test, right, or play test, or
Yes.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you take that much feedback from so many different people who like so many different editions and make it actionable feedback that doesn't just turn into, hey, make it 2nd edition, or hey, make it 4th edition?
Yeah.
How did you guys tackle that?
Well, the easy answer is that we had some really smart and really talented people that were handling that kind of thing. I mean, not enough can be said about the people who created our surveys. Not enough can be said about the people who did all the data analysis of those surveys. My sort of partner in crime at Wizards, who co-designed Lords of Waterdeep with me, Peter Lee. Peter actually did a lot of really great work taking the feedback and analyzing it and looking for trends and looking for not just, here's what people are saying, but also we used to call it the sort of canary in the mine situation, where when a lot of people are saying, hey, this thing is a problem, we would always see that not necessarily as, oh, that thing is a problem, but there is a problem that needs to be solved. Because a lot of times people would be reporting, oh, we have this problem here, and it's actually something else in the system that is causing that problem. It's just you don't interface with the problem until you start using this other mechanic, this other class, or rule system or whatever. So Pete was really good at finding the canary in the mine, and then once we had done that, it was kind of up to us to use our own experience to diagnose what the actual problem was and then come up with a solution. But yeah, like the playtest, the open playtest process was actually totally great. The game would not be as good as it is without it, and there were several times where I would, like, my natural instincts would be, oh, let's do this thing this one way, and then the audience would come back with their feedback, and I'd be like, oh, actually, that's not what our fans want. Well, that's actually good to know, because if we didn't do the playtest, we never would have known that, and we would have put something out that people didn't like.
Where do you start when it comes to something like that? Because, I mean, obviously we can all guess that there's just tons of stuff that goes into publishing any sort of game, especially running the playtest and the art that goes into the books and the mechanics like you were talking about. So what's phase one when someone decides, you know what, we should make a 5th edition, a next, or any type of game? What what magic button does someone push to get that started?
Well, the real first step is to come up with your sort of clear design goals. I mean, a huge part of the 5th edition design process that happened well before we even made our first announcement that we were working on it was identifying what our goals were for the game. Like, what kind of game experience are we trying to produce? And that was not an easy process. It wasn't like we just went in and wrote it up on a whiteboard and it was like, yep, that's what it's going to be, all right. A lot of it was actually just, us banging our heads against the wall and thinking about, like, okay, what do we think our audience wants? What is sort of so ingrained in the fiber of what Dungeons and Dragons is that we can't remove it or can't do without it? And by the same token, what is extraneous? What's been introduced later? So for us, what we did was we started by we played through every single edition of the game, and we did so in rapid succession, and we did that so that we could see what was the same about every edition of D&D? What kept coming back over and over again? What had changed? And so, like, one of the things that we learned early on was, like, oh, okay, when you make the switch over from 2nd to 3rd edition, the way the rules are written actually changes, and it really talks a lot more about players interacting with mechanics as opposed to characters doing things in the world. And we kept finding things like, oh, first edition and OD&D really seem to make this default assumption that there's tons and tons of exploration going on, whereas when you get into, like, 3rd and 4th edition, that expectation isn't so ingrained in the rules, right? So we learned all these different things by playing the different editions of the game, and that allowed us to sort of plant our flags for, like, okay, these are our goals for the game. And then, part of it also was just, like, looking at the realities of our player base, right? Like, people don't have time anymore, right? Like, we always said that our biggest competitor is we're not competing for people's dollars, we're competing for people's time, right? We have to provide the most exciting, most fun, most entertainment you can get in a 1-hour session, in a 4-hour session, etc. And we have to do that by playing to the strengths of the role-playing game. Now, I mean, we're not going to out video game a video game. We're not going to, out card game a card game. What we can do is we can make the best damn role-playing game that we can, the best version of D&D that we can, and make it so that the value you get out of it for your time is really high. I mean, we used to, use the phrase respecting our players' time, and that's what it really boils down to is, when people devote hours, days of their lives to create an adventure or to put together a gaming group and run a session, we have to respect that. And so we have to go back and look and say, okay, what is going to give our fans the most bang for their buck in that hour? So, like, a lot of that is just really setting our goalposts for the game, and that way we were able to say, okay, every time we had to make a decision during the design process, we could look at our goalposts and say, like, okay, is this thing we're making, this class or race or whatever, is this helping us hit some goal that we have set for ourselves? And if it is, great, we'll test it. If it's not, we actually need to really, really carefully evaluate it. And so, like, one of our early goals, of course, is we want a game that plays quickly without a lot of stopping to look things up in the book. And so when we have that goal in place, every time we create a rule, we're basically saying, okay, this is a thing that someone either has to learn know by heart, or they're going to have to look it up. So that really put up sort of a high wall around the core rules of our game, because more rules is actually kind of rubbing up against, not being not moving towards one of our goals.
That's phenomenal. I mean, that chunk alone is full of tons of really good information. I think the thing that really stood out to me the most is I think it's really easy to sit down and be passionate about something and not have any clear goals. And so that's something that I think immediately, for any publisher, you have to understand and realize what is the target I'm trying to hit, and then you can focus at that exact target. So that's pretty phenomenal.
I think it's a really important part of game design, and I think it applies whether you're working on D&D or Magic the Gathering, or like now even I work at Bungie now and working on Destiny. We have to have very clear goals for anything that we create, right? And I think that's something that it took me a long time to learn as a game designer. I mean, I freelanced for 7 years before I got hired by Wizards of the Coast, and it wasn't until I got to Wizards that I finally really understood that aspect of game design, that there's a thing that has to happen before you start thinking about game mechanics, before you start writing, before you start coming up with a setting or whatever that is. You need to sort of figure out what your goals are for it, because if you believe in those goals, if you think that, yes, this is the experience that I want to create, this experience is what I want my game to provide, if you have that, then it actually makes the design process a lot easier, because you're always able to look back to that. If you don't have that, not only does it make your job harder, but it's going to show in the final product. I mean, like, I've played plenty of games where I'm like, there's some neat ideas in here, but this game doesn't know what kind of game it wants to be. Finding the game's identity early and often is one of the hardest parts of designing a game. And so anyone who's out there thinking about doing any indie game design or publishing or what have you, I would say that before you write word one of your game's design, you need to write a whole bunch of goals, or not a whole bunch of goals. You need to put a whole bunch of time into thinking about your goals, because like your goals might only be like 3 things. Like, hey, I want to make a worker placement game that you can play in an hour and ramps up in complexity, right? Like that was sort of the 3 goals that we had for Lords of Waterdeep were, I want to create a worker placement game that plays in an hour and that has a lot of interaction. Like there's just 3 pretty simple goals, but that guided our entire design process in Lords of Waterdeep. So it's one of the first pieces of advice that I give to game designers these days, that you cannot undervalue that goal setting process.
So let's talk about something that I think is a good barrier of entry to indie publishers, which is making the adventure. Throwing an adventure up on DriveThruRPG.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about how you have tons of experience freelancing, and then moving to Wizards, you realize that process is different. So taking that same goal-oriented approach, how does a new author who wants to write an adventure apply those principles to, okay, I want to write my first adventure? I mean, what would you do differently at Wizards than you did freelancing?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to starting by thinking about the experience that I'm trying to provide. Because like a lot of times when I design an adventure for my home game, it just starts with like, oh, okay, I want to have an adventure that has a giant snake statue that breathes fire, right? Like that's not an experience. That's just like a cool thing that's going to go in my adventure, right? But I mean, it's awesome, but it's not an experience, right? If I'm writing something that I want other people to play, that I want other people to run for themselves, I probably start by I start by saying, okay, what feelings am I trying to evoke from this adventure? What am I trying to get other people to experience with this game? I mean, a lot of what I do, nowadays is I refer to it as experience design. It's not just game design. It's like I'm trying to create an experience. An experience is not just like, the details, like who's the bad guy and who are your allies and things like that. An experience is, what do I feel when I'm doing this? And that's a whole range of like emotions. Like, oh, okay, I want my players to feel time pressured, but I also want them to feel scared, right? Like they're just 2 experience goals that I might create, right? And then I might say, okay, well, that's going to be a pretty intense experience. So I also want there to be moments of levity in here. So like that's going to then guide, like, oh, okay, well, if I want to give people a break in the action, I need to be thinking about, like, is there an NPC that I can have in here, or is there a scene that I can have coming up every now and then that is giving people that respite from the fear and time pressure that they're experiencing.
Do you do something similar, like kind of like setting those limitations for yourself to make sure that the game feels the way you want it to feel, and constantly going back and checking and making sure, yes, this is kind of creating the feeling that I want people to
Yeah.
get while they're playing the game? Do you give that same sort of limitation to content? Like, do you decide, you know what, there's going to be 3 of this, 4 of this, there's going to be 2 pages of this, and that's it? Or do you just kind of let the creativity fly and then assemble something from the pieces?
Well, it was very tempting for me as a freelancer to do it the way that you said first. Like, okay, there's going to be this many words on this page and this many words on this page, because as a freelancer, I was being paid by the word. Now, and I would encourage any game designer or tabletop publisher to really think in terms of rather like the whole experience package that I'm trying to produce, because the thing is, it's already hard enough to get people to pick up and look at your game, right? Like, we're competing for people's time here. People have more games than they can possibly play. So if a game or an adventure or a supplement or whatever doesn't have a clear vision for the experience that it's trying to provide, people aren't going to get it when they first pick it up, right? Like, if I create an adventure that's like, okay, I'm going to put like this old like rundown frontier town on it, and then there's going to be space aliens, and then also it takes place with the volcano, and there's an erupting volcano in the background. Like, what the hell adventure am I just creating there, right? And like, you walk into the store and you see that, and it might be like, oh, what do you know, volcano and aliens in an old western town. Like, I guess that's an experience somewhere there, but instead, if I'm really like driving in a particular experience, like, okay, I want to give someone the feeling of you're playing through the D&D version of Cannonball Run, right? I don't know, I just made that up, right? If D&D version of Cannonball Run, like, I can sell that to somebody as a concept. And when I say sell, I don't mean like take their money. I mean, I can pitch it to you and be like, D&D Cannonball Run, go, right? And like, people will get that and they'll understand. And then if your design is backing up that experience that you're trying to create, they're going to get something better out of it, because it's very easy for me to know what I'm trying to create when I create an adventure for my own home gaming group. But if I were then to take my mishmash of notes and hand it to another person, they would have no idea what I'm trying to produce here, right? So in order to communicate to the other dungeon master, the dungeon master who's trying to run the game, or to the player who's picking up this player supplement, what this thing is that I'm trying to give to them, I have to have that clear experience vision behind it. Otherwise, they're not going to get it. No matter how hard, no matter how many words I write, no matter how many pictures I put in, if it doesn't have a clear vision, it's just not going to click for people.
No, that's phenomenal. And so the other thing I'm thinking is that a lot of us, I mean, even us, is, we have this indie company called Absolute Tabletop, and all of us have our own campaign worlds, and once the system is done, so let's say I'm going to make a D20 adventure, and I've decided that, so I don't have to worry about the system, but I want to begin to publish regularly. How did you decide, okay, this first run is going to be this type of thing? We're going to build this part of the world first. And, how do you focus in? Where do you put your lens? Because we don't know where to start. We wish we could write a whole campaign Bible, but we have to do it like 10 pages at a time.
Sure. Well, the truth of the matter is that people don't really need giant 300-page tomes of campaign settings, right? Like, I don't know, maybe I'm veering into personal opinion too much here, right? But
no, love it,
like,
man.
I think the days of the 300-page tome campaign setting, those days are over, right? People just don't have time to read and digest that kind of thing. And I'm sure there's plenty of people that like to buy them and read them, but practically that can be not very useful, right? Like, you can give me 500 pages worth of information on your campaign setting that is practically useless to me. So it's not about size or word count or scope or anything like that. It's about utility, right? What you really want to be looking at is, if I give you 16 pages on a town, that 16 pages can be full of extremely useful at the table material and that will be more useful to me than, here's the 200 pages on the religion of my campaign setting or whatever, right? So I highly encourage people to start thinking about utility. And as for like, where do you start? That's usually, like, I just start where I'm excited, right? Like, oh, I've got this really great idea, and it's got me energized and excited, and like, I want to really write about this city that is on the edge of an active volcano or whatever. I'm really hitting that volcano hard today. But like, if I'm excited about it, that's going to come through in the design. That's going to come through when people read it, right? So personal excitement is one of the most valuable things that you can follow as a creator. So find the thing that you're jazzed about, start there, but then start thinking about like what do people actually need to use this thing? Because as soon as you start veering off on a tangent where it's like, oh, okay, now let me tell you all about the history of the 9 realms, it's like, well, does any of this actually matter at the table? Right? Like, if my players are diving through a dungeon, how much of this history actually matters right now, right? So that's another thing I really look at for people when I'm looking for a new setting or whatever. If I pick it up and it's a giant wall of text and it's all about like, and here's what happened in the 3rd century, it's like going right back on the shelf, and I'm not gonna buy it. Yeah. I just like. I think those kind of the reason I say that the 300 or the giant 300-page tome campaign setting is dead is because people don't have time to learn that anymore. Like, the vast majority of dungeon masters don't have the time or patience or honestly need to learn that anymore, because we have, over the last 30 some odd 40 odd years, right, we have taught people that we've taught our players that they don't need us, right? Like, that's sort of the secret, not secret of Dungeons and Dragons. Like, the players don't need us, right? They can create. Dungeon masters don't need us. They can create things that are really fascinating and compelling and interesting, and honestly, tailored to their own gaming group way better than any professional game designer could, right? Mm-hmm. And we've empowered people to do that. So for your setting or whatever, your adventure, to draw somebody in, it has to get over that barrier of like, yeah, I could probably do something that is better for my own players. And so the way you do that is by making it useful, because on the flip side, like, yeah, DMs can really create interesting things that are tailored to their own campaign settings, their own groups, but they might not have time to do so. So what you want to do is find ways to give people experiences that they can get into quickly, that the DM can digest quickly, and that also has a lot of use at the table. Because if you can overcome the time barrier, the time spent prepping, the time spent at the table, etc., that'll be a highly viable thing for people.
And it goes back to the adage of, story is conflict, and really conflict is character. Like, if you want to show me a part of your world, show it to me in action, affecting people that I can learn to care about in a small lens. And then all of a sudden I start to care, and then I'm like, well, what happens next? And what happens next? And so one of the big things,
I actually think that. Sorry. Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I think that the old Dragonlance adventures, like the first edition Dragonlance adventures, are a fantastic example of my wife walking into the room behind me and not realizing she's being broadcast on the internet.
And what's cool is that her name Internet is actually below there.
Internet says hi.
Internet says hi.
Anyways,
fans have some questions.
I think the first edition Dragonlance adventures, I'm sure they do. Like, what are you doing with this madman? Yeah, the first edition Dragonlance adventures are actually spectacular at this, because they introduce you to a brand new campaign setting through actual play. They might have their own issues, they might not work for your group or whatever, but I'm actually kind of surprised we haven't seen a surge of like adventure paths or campaigns that are the campaign setting, right? Like, here's this whole new setting, and instead of giving you the 300-page book, I'm giving this to you in a 10 adventure campaign or something like that.
You will see that now. Ladies and gentlemen, by Christmas on AbsoluteTabletop.com.
You're writing checks, Tim. You're writing checks.
Woo! Okay, I shouldn't have said that. By Thanksgiving. No.
Oh, God.
No, that actually is. It's funny because it's one of those things where we're doing it on accident, not so specifically. Genuinely, though, I think that is something we'll target next. But we've started to do smaller supplements in our own worlds where we've had to do what you're describing. You just learn as you go through this one piece, and also making it functional enough that you could drop this piece into your world without having to learn a bunch of stuff. So one of the things that was really interesting, especially when we first started doing this, is I learned personally I couldn't do it alone. So for me anyway, because we were doing the full thing, we weren't just freelancing as far as writing and then sending it into an established publisher. We were writing, putting it in InDesign, editing, doing the whole, everything.
Mhm.
So what I learned is one of the most important things is to find a team that you gel well with. And it really seems in
Mhm.
all the panels and everything like that, it seems like, you and Mike Merles and Chris Perkins, it seems like you guys were all on that same sort of level. So what I'm curious about is how do you decide whose ideas and what and whose job is to come up with what? Like when you have this cool idea about the volcano alien western town, how do you guys come together and sort of say, okay, well, we're going to use your western town, but because we've had to kind of figure that out for us, but how did you guys do that?
Well, I mean, we in some ways this is actually something that was really easy for us because we had 40 years of history to guide us, right? I mean, we said often that we were not the owners of Dungeons and Dragons; we were the stewards of it, right? So, for us, a lot of it really came back to like whenever there was anything that was I don't want to say controversial but like when there was any kind of conflict about anything, we could always sort of go back to the history of D&D and say like, okay, how does this fit into the context of 40 years of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So we had it easy. Like we had those kind of guideposts. In a broader sense, when you talk about sort of different creative ideas clashing or butting heads against each other, there's unfortunately not really an easy answer to like how do you make that decision. A lot of it just boils down to like having a lot of mutual respect for each other's ideas, and then also learning how to riff off one another. So like if you say, "Hey, I've got this idea," and I say, "Let's instead do this totally different thing," that's sort of a conflict, right? But if I can instead take your idea and riff on it and be like, "Oh, that's an interesting idea. What if we did that, but then we also did this other thing on top of that?" That then starts to become more of that collaborative process, right? And that is it's a skill that is difficult to learn, and it's something that I have to struggle with on a daily basis, right? Like I'm always having to think to myself, like, okay, this person has an interesting idea. Can I make it work with the sort of goals that we have, or whatever, right? So I think a lot of it just comes down to a combination of like mutual respect, and then also realizing that when you are working with other creative people, other talented, creative, intelligent people, um, sometimes you should fight for your ideas, and then sometimes you should set them aside. Where that line is, unfortunately, there's not an easy answer. I can't just be like, oh, well, actually, you always do it this way, right? Because that's not the case at all, right? But then also, this is where your goals really are going to come in handy, right? Because if you're like, oh, shit, I think we should do Western Volcano Alien Town, and someone else is like, no, that's dumb. We should do Undersea Landmine Town or something. I don't know. Then you should be able to look back to your goals and say, like, okay, which one of these actually achieves our goals the best? And if the answer is both of them, then figure out a way to mash them together. If the answer is neither of them, go back to the drawing board. And then if the answer points to one of the two of them, well, you kind of have your answer at that point, right? So, again, this is where having this sort of clear goals, that clear experience goal from the very beginning is going to come in very handy.
I think both of those crazy towns that you guys came up with are both Palladium books. Actually, I'm pretty sure I saw those already.
Almost certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Riff's Western Alien Volcano.
So
It's a 64-page book.
yeah, exactly. Oh man. So in this community we have a bunch of creators, and something is in my view has happened in the last month or two is that people are just publishing. All of a sudden people are like, you know what, I can do this. I can do this myself. Same thing happened in the music industry. Yep. Like all of a sudden people are realizing they can do this stuff themselves. Now, so talking to you, the creator, if step one for you is writing words onto paper with a pencil, what is step zero for you creatively? Like, how do you get into the mindset? How do you decide what you're going to write? How do you get creative?
I mean, I actually just I'm constantly jotting down ideas. Like I have files on my computer that are just like, I had a crazy idea during my morning commute, and when I got to work, I wrote it down and I stick it aside somewhere. And so, like for me, it's just when those crazy ideas gel together and to form a critical mass. Right now, it's not always that easy, right? And there's plenty of times where I've been like, I had this great idea, and I noodle with it for 6 months, and then I'm like, maybe it wasn't so great after all, right? But I think this is actually something I learned when I was in college. When I was in college, I studied creative writing, and that was what I got my degree in. And I had an English teacher who said that you should always, and keep in mind this was 1998, so this is pre me owning a smartphone. But I had a college professor who was like, you should always carry around a little notebook with you, so that if you're sitting in the cafeteria or waiting on the bus or whatever, and you have an idea, jot it down so that you don't forget it, right? And this is a technique that I still use to this day. And what'll happen is, like, I'll have an idea during my morning commute, I'll jot it down, I'll come home that night, I'll think about it some more, I'll have another idea that works with it, so I add that to the list, and eventually, like, some of these things, like, I've got a dozen Word documents on my computer that are all, like, 2 sentences, right? And it's like, okay, well, there might be a game there, I don't know, but there might not be, right? And then I've got some that are up over, like, 30, 40 pages of just, like, idea, like running ideas and stuff like that. And then eventually something is going to hit critical mass, and then that's where I'm going to go from there. Actually, I'm going to refer to Lords of Waterdeep a lot because it's the sort of most condensed version of the game design process. 5th edition was drawn out over the course of 4 years, basically. With Lords of Waterdeep, that was one that we had, me and Peter, we had disparate ideas that eventually, when we gelled them together, we hit a critical mass. It was like, oh, okay, like I see how this blob of ideas that we have is now gelling into a single experience. And once we hit that critical mass, that's the part where we actually started designing. So, it's a pretty simple technique just to constantly be jotting down notes. But the other thing I think it does is that it reinforces your ideas to yourself. And so what'll happen is, like, just that act of writing it down might make me think about it a little bit more, so that tomorrow I have that follow-up idea that I can jot down. It's this sort of cyclical process where it's like the reason you take notes in history class isn't because you need to study necessarily. It's the act of taking notes into your brain.
Awesome.
I think we've all been there where it's in the moment you're like, oh yeah, this is great, and then you wake up the next day and you're like, shape-shifting bears.
Yeah.
What was this about? So
Yeah.
one of the things that I totally relate with is exactly what you're saying. I'll have the notepad on my phone, I'll email it to myself, and then I go through the emails at some point over the course of a few days, and I cut and paste them into various Google Docs, so that if it's like sci-fi inspiration, such and such. So yeah, totally, the idea net is super important.
He's not lying. He has 5 million Google Docs.
I totally do.
I believe you. I've got folders full of 1 and 2 sentence ideas, right?
Totally.
But one of the other things I'll do is if I start hitting a critical mass, and it's something that is sort of genre related, like, I want to do I want to do a superhero game set in a aquatic setting or whatever, right? I'll be like, okay, I've got this idea. It's kind of genre related. I want to go consume that genre. So I'll go watch a bunch of superhero movies or read a bunch of comics or go learn a bunch about scuba diving on Wikipedia or whatever, right? And then that will continue to stimulate me in creating new ideas that go along with the genre that I'm trying to work in.
Awesome. And so I've got a question here actually from one of the other members of Absolute Tabletop. He actually had us ask you this question. He can't be here right now, but how do you go about playtesting unique mechanics? So the advantage, disadvantage system springs to mind, but if, as a new publisher, sometimes one of the things we're trying to do is take a concept and then just put a simple, cool new mechanic on there just so people can have a new angle to come at it from. How would you playtest something like that to make sure it's balanced? And that's from Matt Click from A Fistful of Dice.
Sure. Well, I mean, not to sound too simplistic, but the actual truth is that you should simply take it and put it in front of players and then see what happens, right? We went through a process that was it was very iterative, right? It was like, okay, we'll create it, we'll play it, we'll figure out what we like and don't like, and then we'll iterate on it, and we'll do it again and again and again, right? I think this is a great process. I highly recommend it, and I use it in tabletop games. I use it in digital games, role-playing games, all different kinds of games. This iterative process is fantastic. But I think one of the things that I would encourage you to do is never be afraid to try it out. Right, get it in front of players as soon as possible. Get it in front of the largest number of players that you can get it in front of. And then another thing I would highly encourage you to do is what we call blind playtesting, where I will and you kind of have to wait till a later stage in the process to do this, but I will a lot of times take a board game idea and I'll say, okay, I really think this is in a good enough shape that I want to see how it would react, or how people would react to it in the wild. I'll get a group together, I will hand them the game, and then I will step aside and not say anything else for the rest of the playtest. Don't answer questions. Do not confirm their assumptions. Like if someone's like, "Hey, does this work like this?" Don't say a word, right? And just observe and see what they get right and see what they don't get right, and see what the pain points are. See what the struggles they have are. See what they like. See what works as intended. See what works but not in the way you intended, and you'll learn a whole lot about your game or your mechanic just by that technique, because that's what's going to happen out in the real world, right? Like you can't ship yourself with every product, right? But again, that's something that you have to wait until your game or adventure or whatever has reached a certain point before you can do that. It has to be a certain level of completeness before you can do that. But yeah, we had a mantra that I stole from my good buddy Paul Peterson at PopCap Games, and that is fail early, fail often. Right, like failure is actually good in game design, because every time you do something and fail at it, you're learning something. Right, like there are times during the 5th edition design process where there would be a mechanic that we're like, you know what, we know this actually isn't great, but we don't know how to fix it right now, so we're going to put it out there in front of our playtesters, and we're going to say, like, we're just going to put it out there and see what they respond to, because their response might tell us why we don't like this mechanic. And like, because there were plenty of times where I can look at something and be like, I don't like this, but I can't put my finger on why I don't like it. And then that way, like, we can see, like, oh, okay, our players didn't like it because of this. That means X, Y, Z, and then go from there. So not being afraid to put it out there for playtesting. I mean, you have to have a little bit of a thick skin. You have to understand that, like, yes, not everything you create is going to be perfect or good. I create many things that are actively bad, but the playtest process reveals those things, right? So yeah, fail early, fail often, iterate, and do not fear the blind playtest.
That's phenomenal advice. I also think. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's pretty obvious stuff, right? It's like, yeah, get people to play your game, duh, yeah, okay. But I can't emphasize it enough, because when I was freelancing, I often skipped the playtesting step, and not because I was like, my stuff is perfect, whatever, but it was like I don't have time, right? Like I'm on deadline, I got to turn this in, right? And that was one of the worst things I could do, and I did it, and every time I did it, it came back to bite me in the ass.
Well, that was going to be the follow-up. Is what do you think? If you think something's good at first level, how long do you think creatively, to be able to let someone play test it and then distance yourself from what you were originally going for anyway? Like, what do you think a good cycle is? How long should a publisher leave themselves?
Well, I mean, it's going to depend on the scope of what you're trying to accomplish, right? If you're just putting it together an adventure, like, you should be making changes very quickly, right? If you're talking about, like, a $70 board game or something that's going to, sell, you're hoping to sell 10, 15, 20,000 copies of, you have to be a lot more meticulous about it at that point. If you're talking about, like, I want to put up a PDF of a new class that, you're probably going to get 600-800 sales or whatever like that, then you should be willing to pivot much more quickly, right? Like, it's just, it's all about scope in my mind, right? And then also, like, if the response comes back very early and very negative, even if it's something that you thought was going to be really big, maybe, like, okay, well, maybe I was wrong, right? And, like, maybe this was actually not as good as I thought it was, and it's time to make that change. Anytime it comes back, like, mixed, at that point, it's like, okay, like, I need to improve some things. Some people like these things, some people didn't, but, like, that should give you, an indicator of this is worth iterating on, as opposed to, like, maybe it's back to the drawing board.
So this question is going to be somewhat of a different rail, but what's your favorite RPG supplement, personally? Not that you, not
Oof.
necessarily one that you made, but if you had to pick one RPG supplement to get
I'm sorry.
into gold.
I'm looking at my library is right here next to me, so I'm like looking at my bookshelves to
Take your time,
see if I can
man.
think
It's
of
a
it.
big one.
Gosh, it is. So I can't give you one, but I'll give you a few. So some of my favorites are I love the Al-Qadim campaign setting for D&D Second Edition. It's the sort of Arabian Nights inspired campaign setting. By far my favorite setting. It also my love of Al-Qadim caused all my my co-workers at Wizards of the Coast to develop a joke that I just love anything with sand in it because I also like Dark Sun, and I was working on the Star Wars RPG at the time, so I did a lot of work with Tatooine. So I was like, it's got sand in it. Of course, Rodney likes it. But yeah, I love that original Al-Qadim. The whole Al-Qadim line is actually totally great. But those first releases were really influential for me. There's a supplement by West End Games for the D6 Star Wars RPG called Fragments from the Rim. It's one of the Galaxy Guides, and it was just this hodgepodge of random stuff that, like, I don't know why, but it just really spoke to me as a young gamer, and that's always been sort of one of my favorites. Trying to think if there's anything else here that really sings to me that I would call super influential for me. I mean, there's a lot of things. Like, depending on the game, I'm always going to have, like, oh yeah, this is the thing that I really love from this game. But, like, I actually, like, sitting here looking at D20 Modern, right? Like, I was a huge fan of D20 Modern. I actually got to work on the product line a little bit, but I didn't work on the base game. So if you count D20 Modern as a supplement to the D20 games, then I would count that one as well. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I just digest games super, like, frequently. Like, I love all kinds of different RPGs. So I'm looking here at my shelf, and I've got 50 different systems to choose from. So it's a big question.
Yeah, no kidding.
Well, and so this sort of brings me to, this is another kind of tough one, but it's in the same vein. What's that thing you can't resist? Like, if you're, either whether you see it online or if you're kind of walking through a store and you see it, is it roll tables? Like, what's that little kitschy splat book that you're like, oh man, I love extra classes, or I love it when they do just a quick town that I can drop into my RPG? Is there something that you're like, yeah, I just collect these things?
Actually, self-contained indie RPGs. Like, I have like a whole shelf up here that is all like even like little thin pamphlet sized all the way up to something as thick as like Fate or something like that. Every year when I go Gen Con, I always come back with half a dozen random indie RPGs. Those have a lot more appeal to me than supplements do, because for the most part, if I'm playing a game, I tend to make my own material for it, but new systems I always feel like I can learn a lot from. Also, like, I really think indie games do a really great job of picking that experience and then going for it. Like, there's, oh gosh, what is the name of that game? It's a I can't remember the name of the game, but it's basically the reverse of the many players, one dungeon master experience. It's many dungeon masters, one player. I can't remember what it's called. It's sort of like a Greek myth style game. Becoming. No, is it Becoming? I can't remember.
You should totally check. They would love you right now if you checked and told us.
My indie games are slightly out of reach right now. Actually, hang on.
Okay, do it.
Oh, it's going to be Becoming. I'll bet you it is.
Yeah.
Google magic.
No, sorry. It's upstairs in my game room.
Google says it might be Becoming RPG by Brian Engard.
I think that's what it is. Yeah. Super great idea, right? Love how creative it is, but it's really like it's aiming at this one experience and then it executes on that experience. So that's why like indie RPGs are my sort of irresistible go-to thing, especially if they're all self-contained. Like, if I see a new RPG and I see a bunch of supplements for it, I'll kind of be like, I might give that one a pass. I don't know why. I can't explain it. Totally the opposite of how I was 15 years ago. But yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, I was just telling you. I thought you were muted, Tim. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, cool. So something else, and this is sort of, and it might be outside of the scope of what you handle on the day-to-day, but one of the big questions out there is the digital versus the print sort of, what is okay, what is helping, what is hurting, and so on. It's a big, broad question, but on that side of things, do you think that online distribution of RPGs is hurting companies who do only print books, or do you think that it is a necessary thing in the market right now?
I mean, are there any companies that do only print? Because I mean, even Wizards of the Coast now has D&D Classics, right? I just think it's a part of games publishing now, right? Like, some people choose to opt in, some people don't. But I don't think we're actually competing for money, right? Like in general, I don't think tabletop games compete on money so much as they compete on time. Time at the table, time to prep for, time to obtain, etc. So in some sense, like PDF releases are cutting out one of the time pressures, which is time to obtain, right? But at the same time, if it's not going to adequately compete for your game table time, it's not really any kind of, I mean, lots of things aren't threats to other games. I think there's plenty of gaming dollars to go around. Let's put it that way. I think that the more competitive access is going to be time, and that's why when you hear people saying like, "Oh, I like this game better," or "I like this game better," it's not like I like this game better because it was cheaper or because I got it in PDF or whatever, right? Or I got it in hardcover. Like sometimes you will, but for the most part, it's going to be about like what did this game make good use of my time? Did this game respect my time, right? Does this game make my players want to come back to my house and play games again, right? Does this make my players hate me, right?
Yeah.
So again, I think the PDF versus print, like that's just a matter of like what can you afford to do as a publisher. Do you want to do print only? Do you want to do PDF only? Like you got to make the best call for your business, but that's not like I don't see that as being a dividing line for like what makes something competitive with someone else. Like there's a convenience factor of like if you play D&D and you can have your adventure on your iPad, like that there's some appeal to that for me, right? But I think that it's not the big divider. I think it's all about the play experience and the time that it takes to play the game and the value you get out of playing for X amount of time.
That is my favorite answer to that question. I've never heard anybody put it that way, and I think the biggest thing that I'm pulling from this whole thing, and that I would encourage anyone who's watching to get tips on tabletop RPG publishing, is that it's the time. And I love that idea, and that is my favorite answer to that.
I was just going to say that I think that's what everybody's going to walk away from is. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, it's not about being the fastest game possible, right? Like it couldn't be that there are plenty of board games that I play that are like 4-hour games, right? As long as the value I'm getting out of that time is high, then that's going to be what makes the game successful, right? I don't want to spend a lot of time during a role-playing game looking up rules, right? But if I'm playing a strategy board game and a lot of my time is spent like thinking about my strategy and executing on it, like it doesn't matter if it's a 4-hour game or not if it's made good use of that time. So I hope, like I know I'm banging the time value drum here, that's right good. But I want people to remember it's not just make your game fast, it is maximize the amount of entertainment people are getting for the time that they're spending.
Now, how do you, as a publisher, how would you recommend you kind of keep yourself in check, or how would a publisher check that and look at their own product that they just made and say something like, yes, this is worth the time for what it is? Is there any way to do that, or is that just the non-existent answer?
That's playtesting, right? Like that's what you're going to get a lot of your information out of playtesting, and that's the thing that you should ask your players, right? Like if you ask your players, was this game too long? And they say yes, that doesn't mean that the game took too much time necessarily. It might mean that the game wasn't providing enough entertainment for the time that it was consuming, right? If you ask your players, was this game too short? That might mean like the game was actually just it was too short. People want to keep playing your game more, right? But there's like if it's not enough entertainment bang for your time buck. There's many different axes that you can tweak to enhance that. Make the game shorter, make it more like make sure you cut out the things that are harming your entertainment value. But again, that's all kind of come down to people actually playing your game, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Real humans actually playing your game is so vastly more, it's like worth so vastly more than every amount of like thinking and game design and blah blah blah. Like no, like what matters about a game is what happens at the table, right? And so if you observe players and they are telling you, hey, this game feels too long, your game is too long. Like you either need to make it more entertaining or make it shorter, but that's the buck stops there at players.
That's great, and it's all about that relativity factor, right? Like a great movie, we never come out of it going, man, that was 2 hours and 20 minutes. You could, like you said, you come out going, oh man, I want to see that again. And so yeah, I think it's about the quality and also making sure you deliver on the goals, which are essentially what? Promises to your players. It's the promises you're deciding as a publisher to make and then deliver on based on the cohesive game you're putting out. So, well, and we're winding down. You know, we have maybe about 10 minutes left. So I was just going to say, we were going to hit some questions from people in the community. It's just kind of quick, rapid-fire ones, more fun, less, you know.
Sounds good. I'll try not to be very verbose.
Oh no, you're good. Hey, listen, we'll stay as long as you want to stay. We just certainly want to be respectful of your time. So we'll take you as long as we can have you. But
well, no, I have to go see The Martian with my wife. So
sweet.
That's not a euphemism. We're actually going to go see The Martian.
Oh, sweet, awesome. All right, so we definitely want to make sure you make your showtime. So I'll start out here. This is from the RPG Brigade. So Spencer Shields wants to know.
Okay.
He'd like to know which of the editions is your personal favorite.
Well, I'm obviously biased in that I got to design one of them, so I have to say 5th edition because I kind of got to design a game that I really like. If you take the one that I worked on out of the running, I'm actually a really big fan of 3.0, and I specifically point that out as opposed to like 3.5, like the original 3rd edition release. It had a lot of problems. Like there's no I would never argue that it was perfect, but I think it is very neat and streamlined, and in some places where as the game grew longer in the tooth, it also got a little more complicated. So I actually really enjoy the very baseline, like released in the year 2000 3rd edition experience.
Awesome. That's a great answer.
Sweet.
This is from Kirk Weeby, not including 5th edition. What product are you most proud of that you worked on? It can be anything. It doesn't have to be tabletop RPGs or anything.
Yeah. It's hard for me to say anything other than Lords of Waterdeep. As far as like the most proud of, that game was my baby. Like me and Pete, we basically forced that game into existence. So I'm hugely proud of Lords of Waterdeep. If you want to talk about tabletop games or tabletop RPGs, though, I would almost certainly have to say the Star Wars Saga Edition role-playing game. I got to shepherd that game for almost 5 years, and so yeah, I'm really proud of it. Again, these are not flawless games. I would never make that argument, but I love them.
That's great. Here's one from me. This is more of another quick punchy one. What is the thing, you know, sometimes you have to murder your darlings. What's the thing that you were just so excited about for 5th, the mechanic especially, and then when it came out in the play test, it just did not fly, and you were really surprised and maybe a little sad?
Yeah. There's actually one long-standing disagreement between me and the rest of our D&D community. At one point, when we first introduced the concept of subclasses into the game, many of the subclasses were very obvious. Like the wizard ones, yeah, okay, it's going to be illusionist, enchanter, etc. For the fighter, we ended up with Battlemaster and Champion and Eldritch Knight, but originally we had much more flavorful subclasses. We had the Knight, the Gladiator, I can't remember what the other one was, right? They had a lot of built-in flavor, and our fans strongly rejected that. And that really, it's like even to this day, I still disagree with the feedback we got from the fans. That's not what I like. I wanted something more flavorful, and I still do. But you know, sometimes what I want and what's good for the game are two different things, right? So yeah, it's funny because like this is something we actually tried. There was a playtest packet where it was like the Knight and the Gladiator and yada yada yada, and our fans were like, "Nope, don't want that. We want something more generic. Don't tell me how to play my fighter." I'm like, "Okay, sure, that's fine. So yeah, that's the one. It's funny. Like I saw my old boss slash friend. He's still my friend, but Mike Merles posted the other day. He was like, "Yeah, I think it was one of our big things that we didn't really put enough thought into was making the fighter subclasses more flavorful." And I was just like, "What are you talking about? We had a playtest where they were more flavorful, and our playtesters rejected that, right?" So yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned that because the Gladiator and the Knight, like you're talking about, those classes, those subclasses, are the reason I still have the D&D Next playtest rules in a binder in that closet because they're awesome. I thought they were.
Like I totally understand why. Yeah, I totally understand why, right? People want the fighter to be very flexible and very I can mold the fighter into creating any kind of character I want. And if I have to choose the knight to get these mechanics, that feels like there's a little bit of dissonance. I totally understand. It's just that was a piece of tension that we had in our game of do we do something that has really strong built-in flavor versus something that is really more of a toolkit? And in the fighter's case, we chose toolkit, even though I would have chosen flavor. Anyhow.
You're muted there, Tim.
Yeah, I was. I do that because I realize watching previous interviews, I do a lot of yesing and talking with my hands, and then it's my dumb face while the people are talking. So I mute myself so that I can go like this. And so then I'm like, if not, it's just me going, I'm not Rodney Thompson. So I was just going to say one final thing. Rodney, is there anything that you would say to the freelancer you that started that 7 years before you got the job at Wizards? If you could just time travel back and sit down and tell yourself, hey, you've got 5 minutes, here's what I want you to do, what would be different? How would you go about it?
Gosh. The first thing I'd tell myself is never undersell yourself and don't accept less than 3 cents a word for any freelancing. And then the next thing I would tell myself is to remember that more isn't always better, that more words doesn't make a product better, that more mechanics doesn't make something more compelling. And that's one of the big mistakes I made early on. The other thing I would tell myself is to playtest. Spend more time playtesting than writing. And I wish I had done that back then. And the other thing I would tell myself is that I would need to learn to think more critically about games. This is something that I didn't really understand until I was deeply immersed in the R&D environment at Wizards, and that is I need to be playing more games. And not that I wasn't playing games before, but I didn't really start playing board games until I got to Wizards, and now I design board games, right? And that's one of those things that if I played those games and I was able to learn from them and think about them more critically, I think I would have ended up in a better place game design wise, because board games especially, but also indie RPGs, any of these games that I don't play that often or that I didn't play when I was freelancing, they have a lot that you can learn from them if you can play them and evaluate them critically, right? And that's a learned skill. It's not something that you can just be like, hey, you should think critically about games. Oh, really? Thanks. I can't believe I didn't think about that, right? No, it's something you have to learn how to do over time. And even now, I still have to force myself sometimes when I'm playing a game to evaluate it with a critical eye, looking for what's good, looking for what's bad, looking for what's, and actually I don't even like those words good and bad, right? Looking for what's succeeding in accomplishing the game's design goals, looking at what's failing at accomplishing those design goals, looking for things that are slow or unintuitive, looking for things that are causing hiccups in the game, looking for things that are causing analysis paralysis, or learning how to identify all of these different aspects of why a game is succeeding or failing. I didn't even start doing that until I got to Wizards, and I wish I'd started earlier because I think it would have helped my design, first of all, but also then I would now have 7 more years of that, because even now I'm learning how to do those things. I mean, I've been designing games professionally for 15 years effectively, right? And during that time, I've learned a lot, but I would have another 7-year head start on myself if I had been thinking about games that way. Before I was when I was freelancing, I spent a lot of times thinking about okay, how can I write the right words into this freelance turnover? Or I don't think that 7 options are enough for this one class feature. Maybe I need to add an 8th, right? No, maybe you need just to have 3 that are really great. So yeah, that I think that's what I would really impart to myself.
Great answers. Barks, is there anything else you want to throw at Rodney while we still have him?
Dude, just my respect, man. This has been awesome talking to you. Thank you very much for answering our questions. This has been great.
Yeah, definitely.
No problem, guys. It's been a pleasure for me too.
Yeah. So, if is there any chance that we can send people your way to promote anything? By Lords of Waterdeep, is there anything that would help you out that we can send or link to or anything like that? I mean, do you want to plug anything currently? Feel free to do that right now.
I don't really have anything that I need to plug or anything like that. If people want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Antarian Ranger, and I will be surprised if people actually know what that is. But it's an obscure Star Wars expanded universe reference because I'm a huge nerd. But yeah, or if you just search for Rodney Thompson Twitter, you'll find it, right? But so yeah, if you want to follow me and get in touch with me that way, you can always. I respond pretty frequently, although sometimes I vanish into a hole at work where I'm like, sorry, can't look at you Twitter, I have to work now. But yeah, other than that, just I don't really have anything.
Well, a million thanks. So again, this has been Rodney Thompson, someone who has so much experience that he has shared with us here. Thank you so much for watching. This is Tim, one half of Tabletop Terrors. James couldn't be here because he's in Boston, kid, looking at jack-o'-lanterns. But
packing his con.
Packing his con, yeah. But so James, shout out to you, and of course Barker. Thank you so much for jumping in and being a part of this, man. And so we are with Tabletop Terrors. Barker is with Be a Better Game Master on YouTube, and we are half of AbsoluteTabletop.com. So go over to AbsoluteTabletop.com, check out the supplements that we're going to be using a lot of Rodney's experience and advice in the very near future. Thanks so much. Happy gaming. Double tap peace, and may your dice roll high.
And go bring Mark Watney home, Rodney.
Yes, I will do so.
All right, guys.